By now, most of you have probably heard of this thing called intermittent fasting. It's made its way into mainstream media in the last 5 to 10 years, and it's really exploded for people that are looking to tackle weight loss. Today's episode here at Beyond the Pump is going to cover what exactly intermittent fasting is, where it came from, and if it's something that you as a coach should be interested in understanding so that we can leverage with your clients, or at least be able to answer the questions that you know are going to come up when they listen to schmucks like Dr. Oz.
So today we're breaking down intermittent fasting and everything that you probably should know as a coach. And if you're not a coach and you're here listening because you're interested in using it for yourself, you're probably going to pull something out of this. But Andrew, I think my first question, because this is one of my fun episodes where I just get to ask questions and be curious. What is intermittent fasting? Let's start. Let's start there.
Uh, well, intermittent fasting is something that's very, very prominent in social media, and it's one of the things that people swear by will help them lose weight. So that's kind of where the question will come from, and why we're talking about it is that clients will ask you about this thing. Now, if you want to be a smarty pants, or if you want to go look up the actual scientific research yourself, you can go look up time restricted feeding, which is effectively you limit your the amount of time that you eat during a day rather than eating like 3 square meals or 5 meals or one meal a day or whatever that looks like. You restrict how much you eat to rather than a certain frequency to a specific time window. So there's a lot of popular ones, 16 and 8, which is basically, you eat for 8 hours a day. You might fast or not eat, until lunch, and then you'll eat from maybe 12 p.m. to 8 p.m. And that's where you're able to, in the most of the literature, you're able to go and eat what's called ad libitum, which is you eat as much as you'd like. And it relies heavily upon like appetite regulation and stuff because as your stomach fills up with food because you haven't eaten, inherently is going to signal some more satiety potentially. So, but basically, yeah, it's just limiting how big your feeding window is or the times that you're allowed to eat. And we all do a version of it anyway because we sleep, 6 to 8 hours.
I was just going to say, isn't technically speaking, if I eat for, let's say, 17 hours a day and don't eat for 7, isn't that technically time restricted
Yeah.
window eating?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, it's basically binge eating. If you want to look at it from the lens of an unhealthy behavior set, and there's a lot of different frames for it, but yeah, basically you're just not eating for a longer period of time than you are allowed to eat. Some people do 12 and 12s, 16 and 8s. Some people will even get as severe as like doing a 20 and 4, which is where you fast for 20 hours and eat for 4. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff around the effectiveness of that, and they actually had a long-term research study that came out probably about a year and a half ago now, where they compared two groups across 10 years. And those are really valuable studies because you actually get to see, rather than a singular snapshot in time where you look at people for 12 weeks, and obviously there's a lot of changes that happen during that time. But the curiosity of what happens beyond that is usually lost because it's really expensive to keep up with a group of individuals. Um, so basically, what they looked at were the two groups of, people that ate a traditional, 3 meal a day, I think, was the non-time restricted feeding intervention. And then there were people that ate on the time restricted feeding intervention. And basically what they found was that there was no difference from a weight loss perspective. So people that are suggesting that it's this godsend panacea of a thing that's supposed to help you lose all this weight and it's better than any other diet, it's really not. It just helps you potentially limit how much we're eating during the day. There are people that might eat all day. They might be big grazers, big snackers, and they might not realize how every lick, nibble, and swallow is what we call it. Like you kind of grab a gummy bear here, a gummy bear there. Next thing you know, you're 2 bags of gummy bears in by the end of your day. But it's supposed to help with things like that, where you're just a lot more intentional, you're a lot more mindful, because you're now having to pay attention to where you're cramming that food in.
So when it comes to intermittent fasting, you were saying that the data suggests it doesn't help you lose weight.
No, if anything, that group just had higher blood pressure. That was the only meaningful And it wasn't even significant, but the people that did restrict their feeding did have a couple percentage points higher.
Got it. So so from that perspective, not beneficial. Now, I'm sure that there's some level of like, hey, if you eat from the point in time you wake up till you go to bed, if you stop eating 2 hours before you go to sleep, you have 2 hours less of an eating window, you're likely going to
Mhm,
eat less than you normally do. That reduction in caloric intake would ultimately lead to some weight loss,
mhm,
and everything from that side. But I guess my question for you, Andrew, would be what is the biggest benefit of some type of intermittent fasting or doing something down that kind of restricted time window? And I know I recently learned something that in my mind that I'm like, oh, I
mhm,
want to stop eating by 7 p.m. Right. And that's
mhm,
just a
mhm.
thing for me with my math. But what is the biggest benefit that somebody might get out of doing some type of IF?
I mean, it's hard to narrow down, honestly, and I will preface this is like there's a lot of different context. I think one of the best things, in my opinion, and I tend to look at it more from a biological clock perspective. We want the hormones that we want at the right time. Like, obviously, when you think about getting up out of bed in the morning, we know that cortisol, which is a stress hormone, is very important upon waking, and in fact, it should theoretically be at highest about 30 minutes after waking. It's called the cortisol awakening response. And what that actually looks like when it's misapplied or abused or it's not functioning correctly is basically an inverse cortisol pattern where you actually get a big spike of cortisol production or stress hormone right before bed. And those people tend to get that second wind. That's where they tend to be a little more awake. That's when they struggle to go to bed at a meaningful hour. And then on the back end of that, they actually feel tired in the morning and they really have a lot of trouble getting out of bed, um, which we call sleep inertia. Basically, it's just kind of keeping you tired. And so that's a great example of what your hormones at the right time of day, what happens when that doesn't occur. So we want to be actually very energetic in the morning and we want to see energy levels naturally drop during the rest of the day. And intermittent fasting can be one of those tools that might help correct or basically help someone start to basically train their body on when to secrete certain things. You have this thing in your brain called your suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is what controls your internal biological clock,
Can
where
you
your
spell that?
suprachiasmaticnucleus, suprachiasmatic nucleus. Can I get that in a sentence, please? Um, but basically, like circadian entrainment is the whole concept of what you do when you train, when you go to sleep, when you eat, when you have sex, when you have an alcoholic beverage. Like all those things start to prime hormones to get secreted at appropriate times. And I think that one of the things that I'll use intermittent fasting for is when people are potentially a little more tired and wired. I might actually squeak that intermittent fasting up closer to their bedtime, and then I might not necessarily give them a recommendation or an RX for having some more carbohydrate in the morning because maybe I want them to actually have a little bit more of a cortisol response. So there's a lot of different ways to take that principle and apply it, but I would say training your internal clock is probably the most helpful thing that goes off literature a little bit that I found in my experience as a coach.
So you bring up the hormone thing, and one thing that I recently have been reading, and I don't know how accurate it is or not, but I know that once you fall asleep, your growth hormone production kind of increases, all those things, right? That's when you're going to
Mhm.
recover
Yeah.
from your workouts, abusing your body, things like that. And if you eat too closely to that falling asleep time, you risk reducing I don't know if it's production or absorption or whatever of that growth hormone, where you then can negatively impact some of the maybe recovery or opportunity, we'll say, right? Is I guess. So
Mhm.
I was reading that. I'm like, all right, well, if I like to be falling asleep somewhere between 9 and 9:30, and this production starts shortly after said truly falling asleep, then I need to make sure that I'm not eating too close. And I've now kind of said I'm just going to stop eating around 7. It's not a hard and fast 7, but
Mhm.
just try to make sure I digest. And we actually had talked in a prior episode about I prefer to go to bed not full stomach,
Mhm.
not starving, but I prefer to go to bed not full stomach anyways. So it
Mhm.
kind of fits. But it gave me a little more. Here's a valid logical reason why I would want that
Mhm.
versus all the things. So slightly more motivating of like, hey,
Yeah.
my body's naturally doing its thing. Let me help it continue to push and help me reach my goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think you highlight a great thing in that. And I think it's really important for listeners to understand research just tries to make sense of a lot of different pieces of information. And so what they do is they take like what worked well for Johnny, Susie, Mrs. Smith, whatever, whatever, whatever. Like, and the more people they have, the longer they look at them, the more meaningful it is because you start to tease out the averages. And but you highlight something that's called the N equals one principle, which just means that everyone is a unique thing. We start with what works well for most people as an average. It's not the perfect thing for everyone. So this is why I say you got to tweak and play around with things, and you should definitely practice the FAFO method and fuck around and find out to make sure that you're collecting, and ultimately the value of a coach is helping someone best individualize and optimize their approach to whatever it is that they're doing. They might find that a 20-4 fast to feeding window might be a better ratio. They might find it's actually a 12-12. They might find it's an 8-16 on the opposite end of they can eat for 16 hours, which traditionally, like when you think about people that are hard gainers, like you can manipulate some of these principles and actually give them an extended feeding window where you have to eat something every hour for 16 hours. And that's like, that becomes a completely different form of abuse. But you have to, exactly what you're saying, 2 hours prior to bed, there is something to be said around that of gastric emptying and your secretion of melatonin, which is the majority of which is produced in your gut. And so if you have a lot of digestive processes going on, you're actually going to decrease potentially some of that secretion. And they found that in a research article about 3 years ago that, before it was like, don't eat carbs or eat carbs before bed. It'll help you sleep by decreasing your cortisol. And unfortunately, like the principle made sense. However, it's not universally applicable because they were trying to manipulate insulin and cortisol as the kind of opposite levers of if you turn on insulin by having blood sugar circulating from a recent meal that you consumed, then what that should do is decrease your body's tendency to try to go in and pull and access things that are already stored. By and large, again, biology is very complicated. That is a potential thing that you can try with your clients if they're struggling to get sleep and maybe they're waking up in the middle of the night. But I think really the main takeaway from what we've really beat into this dead horse up to this point is the fact that these are all just tools, and you need to know what to look for to leverage these tools. And in your case, you sleep better. How did you track that? Would be my question, and then tracking that a little bit further, confirming what you're looking for, and then making those tweaks. But when you found out that you needed to stop eating 2 hours prior to bed, what were you looking at that helps you make that decision and that um, gave you that insight?
Um, I don't remember how I got there. I've been just trying to learn some things around random stuff, right? And it's like, I don't remember what the step prior to it was. I can tell you the total umbrella was finding ways to increase growth hormone.
Hmm.
And like I told you, like, oh, you can go and jab yourself with a needle, which sounds painful and daunting and all the pieces. And I'm like,
Hmm.
before I even like entertain that idea, there's other things you can naturally already do that are going to help with this.
Hmm.
And I don't remember the how I went down some track. It had something to do with probably learning about the actual production process myself and whatnot. And, in my mind, it's like, oh, let me go lift heavy weights and then I increase growth hormone. And like, well, not exactly, as initially thought. So it led me down that path of not eating too close to being asleep, and whatnot was really where it landed me. And I was like, okay,
Hmm.
it makes sense to me, right? And I tend to be the client in this conversation where that fact was a motivating thing for me to put a let me just eat by 7. Some
Yeah.
people probably don't give a shit, because
Mhm.
they don't care.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't understand or whatever, but for me, that was a motivating factor to, okay, I try not to eat close to bed anyways, but instead
Mhm.
of trying not to, let me make sure I don't. And that's
Yeah.
just how that came up.
Yeah, absolutely. And to speak a little bit further, I remember there was a light bulb moment when you started wearing your Whoop strap. It was definitely one of those things where you were tracking it and you were like, "Oh, I noticed." And Whoop gave you those performance assessments every month, and that's where you were tracking that long enough. Meaning, you had an awareness development tool. It's no different than a mile running time trial for people that are trying to get better at cardiovascular fitness, a VO2 max test, a 1 rep max bench press to look at upper body pushing strength. Um, the client monitoring tool, or in this case, the self-monitoring tool, that Whoop strap was allowing you to put that stuff in, and it helped draw those correlations. And so for those of you that haven't gone and watched our wearable episode, it's very helpful if you're trying to figure out which wearable is going to help you potentially get some of that insight. And you're definitely going to want to go and check that one out. It's going to be linked here. That's where the wearables definitely help you gain some insight, because let's be honest, no one's going to take a spreadsheet and input every single hour, every single activity, every single macronutrient. They're not going to necessarily draw those correlations or those parallels. And that's the real use case of those wearables and how they help best optimize that. And if you are a coach and you're listening and you're like, well, I don't know which one's going to allow me to track for myself best, but B, track your clients, because let's be honest, clients really give shitty feedback a lot of times. And the initial part of coaching is training them to give good feedback. So that means that you have to constantly get them to pay attention to, what are you doing? What are you getting? What are you doing? What are you getting? What are you doing? What are you getting? The same way that if you touch the stove, you know it's going to be hot in the future and you're going to try to avoid that pain. You want to see and show what behaviors such as alcohol consumption, right? Using something like Whoop, how many drinks did you have? Well, I know I can have 2 and it doesn't drastically decrease my sleep quality. But if I have 3 or more, it's going to completely fuck my next day. And
I
I'm
can
going to,
have 3 before about 4 p.m.
that's perfect, right? And so now you know how to optimize and enjoy yourself more efficiently without necessarily taking away from your goals. We don't want to have this black and white, don't ever do this. We know that really doesn't work well. I mean, look at the abstinence commercials back in the day. Actually, you know what? Now that I say that out loud, I think about it, and the world population is declining. So maybe there was something to that.
It's just delayed. It's delayed. And here's my thought process. I want to start like, hey, let me start at 6 a.m. one day and see how many I can squeeze in, and just start to understand the impact of alcohol from there. Like let's just start early.
Yeah.
How many can we get in and still have a green recovery the next day?
I think we did tell you. I think you're on a camping trip.
Yeah, you did say like, oh, we should test this, and I'm like, no, I know what you're doing.
Yeah. Well, and that's where I say the law of large numbers. Eventually, if you have enough data points and information capture points of, if you drink enough for across 4 years of wearing your Whoop strap and you're diligent with putting in when you do, you might drink once every 3 months or so, but across 5 years of that, that's what,
20 drinks.
12, yeah, 20 drinking instances where now it has enough to draw a trend line, because you really only need 3 points of 3 Wednesdays in a row. You notice that this is a trend. And in fact, I had a particularly, one of my concierge coaching clients, won't name drop him, but we put a Whoop strap on him and we looked at his HRV and we noticed that his HRV was always really terrible Mondays, Tuesdays, and Saturdays. It turns out that those were the nights that he was out partying. And so we had to reorient, we compromised and changed his training split a little bit. But we also gave him some awareness, like, hey, when you're drinking on Sunday, you're going to mess up yourself on Monday and Tuesday, because he would go so hard after having an event weekend that he really struggled to climb out of that, which decreases productivity for the first half of his week. And, you think about having success in business and coaching and being your sharpest, best self, it really didn't lend itself to that. So, not to make this an episode about wearables, but going back to intermittent fasting, that's part of understanding how to manipulate that specific protocol. Is you have to have some kind of measurement device. And if all you're doing is having people track a spreadsheet, and doing a weekly check-in with them, I think you're going to miss a lot of that enrichment. You're definitely going to want to have some kind of thing where you're actually able to monitor them, probably day by day, and then also use their perspective on how they feel like they're feeling and trying to marry those two together. But that's part of the catch and release where you generate a lot of referrals from a business perspective, is that you teach people how to be good clients, and then you teach themselves how to be good coaches. And then from there, you release them. And that's where, like, oh my God, I had such an amazing experience. Hey, you should go work with Andrew. He's going to teach you how to do these things. He's not going to take your money forever. And he's going to try to actually get rid of you, which I know is very taboo inside of 2024, where we have business gurus that are talking about strategy sprints and doing all type of dumb shit. So,
So
that's what
last intermittent fasting question before we wrap it up here.
yeah.
is, and I'm going to phrase it wrong, but if you intermittent fast for long enough periods of time, do you effectively rebuild your GI tract lining, the cells? Like, does something along those lines happen? Because I've seen that thrown out there where it's basically a way to heal yourself and all of that stuff. So what does that look like? The look on your face is a simple no, but you know.
So, um, yeah. So what you're referring to is a process called autophagy, and it kind of became a little more prominent. There's a couple researchers, Michael Mosley, Dr. Jason Fung, and like, not to plug their stuff because I think they're a little hokey and full of shit, but um, I think they had certain principles that were correct, but they just had gross overreaches and abuse of what that should be. And they were a little too confident with the delivery of that. Not to get lost on that, but autophagy is basically where your body is reducing something called immunosenescence, which is basically where you have all these dead cells and these malfunctioning cells, and that like your DNA just didn't transcribe right. And so they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And they're taking up space, they're taking up oxygen, resources, nutrients, and potentially driving up something called systemic inflammation. Well, if you think about inflammation for a second, because that's really the underpinning idea of why people are trying to popularize it outside of weight loss, is that it's supposed to be this health trend. It's supposed to be this thing that really helps you, heal your body and reduce inflammation. And like, well, your body's actually pretty good at that if you stop fucking around and having 14 drinks every 2 days and getting 4 hours of sleep and drinking coffee and never having water and, binge eating at the end of the day. Like those are things that are going to drive up. Yeah, I know I'm terrible at water. Um, but those are things that are going to drive up inherently inflammation. Is basically everything that we know to be true around self-care. If we're avoiding doing those things, we're actually going to propagate or continue to drive up things that are going to slow our recovery down. We know that if you want your body composition to change, you have to train hard and you have to train as frequently as possible at a challenging intensity. But if you feel like shit all the time and your challenging intensity is like, an 80%, and then you work out so hard that it's a 50% the next time, maybe if you're really good one day and it's like a 95%, and then that tanks you down with 30% recovery. Like you're always having this battery that's half dead. And that's why people have really shitty workouts or they don't feel like they want to train. And that's a really big litmus for if you feel ready to train, if you feel like you're eager, if you feel ready to go hot to trot, then that's probably an indication that rather than wasting a fuck ton of money on labs, your recovery processes are on par and allowing you to really have those body transformations that you're trying to create for your clients. But people have shitty self-care. We're talking about autophagy, which we're stepping over dollars to pick up pennies with that of like, hey, we're going to change, your nutritional feeding frequency. And it sounds like this sexy thing for your clients. They're like, oh, I've never heard that before. And I'm like, yeah, frame it however you need to gain compliance and, for people to actually want to participate with that external motivation factor. But I mean, autophagy is such a small thing. It happens all the time. Your body's constantly killing off cancer cells with tumor necrosis factors, alpha, and like interleukin 6, and like all these pro-inflammatories, anti-inflammatory. If you want to go down the rabbit hole of cytokines, maybe we'll talk about in a future episode. But those are really the things that are managing your immune response, which is if it's upregulated, you're going to have more inflammation. That's not a bad thing because inflammation causes a healing cascade. And when you think about working out, if you didn't have inflammation, you'd feel like shit. You'd be beat up all the time. But the problem is that it's like putting salt in a meal. If you have too much salt, it's going to spoil the meal and you're going to have to throw it away, right? Meaning like you might as well not have cooked it. And it's the same thing with dose response and exercising too hard and having too much inflammation, or working out really hard, but not having the recovery factors to have that come down, right? And so that's where I think autophagy, which is your body's function of killing off dead, malfunctioning cells, really isn't that important as much as it is from a caloric management perspective. Your GI tract, your epithelial lining, basically your intestines have three layers. You have a stirred mucus layer, you have a smooth mucus layer, and then you actually have the smooth muscle. And those things are what create and keep out commensal bacteria and like basically all the nasty pathogens that we're trying to reduce. It regenerates pretty frequently. So if you just stop picking at the scab a little bit, i.e. maybe you do take a little bit longer, maybe your intestines might not be as inflamed, and you might have some positive recovery from that, and that's just a very simple distillation. If you want to know more about that stuff, we have a great friend, Dasha Golnick. She does a lot of gut health stuff. So make sure you go check her stuff out. She helps you navigate things like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and she has some really good content over there. So make sure you check her out if you want to know more about that. But intermittent fasting, by and large, good for weight management. If people want a simple way to eat less, just tell them to eat within a certain window. By and large, they're probably going to get fuller faster, which helps them eat less. But we know that calorie consumption is the biggest, most important thing. Not to say your hormones don't matter, but the biggest, most important thing on how to manage your weight. If you want to manage your body composition, manage your macronutrients, your protein, carbs, and fats. If you're going to manage how you feel, your mood state, and your mental health, manage your micronutrients. And those are basically the three things that go into nutrition and making sure that people have what they need to survive and thrive.
All right. Well, much appreciated. Makes sense. Sounds like intermittent fasting is maybe a little maybe a little bit blown up by all those influence out there who want to latch onto something. So there'll be
Yeah.
something new coming out that we get to chat about. Not necessarily a bad tool, just maybe not the greatest tool ever. But
Yeah. Tool's a tool.
until next time, if you found this useful, subscribe, rate, review, leave a comment. Let us know what you want to talk about, what you want us to talk about. Reach out, ask some questions. Social media is a great place to find us. Instagram, going to be a good spot. And we will see you next time.
See y'all next time.